Good evening everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where ancient stones hold untold tales and the most ordinary lives conceal extraordinary depths. Pull up a comfortable chair, perhaps with a cup of warm tea, and let the gentle rhythm of a long-past Christmas carry you to the heart of an English village. Here, beneath the festive boughs and the soft glow of lamplight, a shadow has fallen, and a mystery begins to unfold. It is a world where observation is a fine art and human nature, in all its perplexing glory, is the truest map to the truth. Prepare yourselves for a journey into the unexpected, guided by the keenest eyes and the sharpest mind. Now, let's start with the first chapter of The Widow's Christmas Disappearance. Chapter 1, The First Whisper of Disquiet. The first snow of the season had fallen, transforming the quaint English village of Oakhaven into a Christmas card scene. Icicles hung like crystalline daggers from thatched roofs, and the ancient stone walls of St. Jude's Church sparkled under a weak, wintry sun. It was Christmas Eve, and a quiet excitement hummed beneath the festive hush. Carols drifted from the rectory, and the scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with wood smoke in the crisp air. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her dear friend Mrs. Caroline Everett at Rose Cottage, found herself enjoying the unexpected beauty. Her shawl drawn tight against the chill, she watched from the parlor window as villagers hurried by, laden with last-minute parcels, their breath pluming in the cold. Mrs. Everett, a woman of comfortable means and a natural inclination towards good works, was bustling about, preparing a basket of mince pies for the needy. Such a pity about poor Mrs. Pendleton, Mrs. Everett sighed, dusting flour from her hands. To be all alone at Christmas, in that large house. Mrs. Eleanor Pendleton was a widow of some years, residing in the imposing, somewhat isolated dwelling known as Oakhaven Manor, on the outskirts of the village. She was a woman of quiet habits, known more for her formidable will and discerning taste than for any particular warmth. Her late husband, a man of considerable wealth, had left her well provided for, but also, it seemed, deeply solitary. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her gaze lingering on the distant, tree-line obscured roof of the manor. One hopes she has her housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, for company. The morning of Christmas Day dawned clear and bright, though still bitterly cold. The bells of St. Jude's chimed their joyous message, calling the faithful to the festive service. The pews gradually filled with the cream of Oakhaven society, their Sunday best a splash of colour against the grey stone. Miss Marple, seated beside Mrs. Everett, greeted acquaintances with polite nods and a serene smile. Yet, as the sermon began, she noticed a ripple of quiet murmuring among some of the village women. Their eyes kept flicking towards a particular, conspicuously empty pew near the front. It was Mrs. Pendleton's usual place, always occupied, rain or shine, health or infirmity. After the service, as the congregants spilled out into the frosty churchyard, the murmuring grew louder, transitioning from whispers to low, concerned voices. Young Mrs. Davies, the baker's wife, clutched her husband's arm. She wasn't there, you see. Mrs. Pendleton. And her lights weren't on last night, not like usual. The vicar, a kindly, if somewhat flustered, man named Mr. Henderson, overheard. Perhaps she felt unwell, my dear, he offered, though a frown furrowed his brow. Mrs. Pendleton was not one to miss Christmas Day service. She held great store in tradition, and even greater store in appearances. But it was Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Pendleton's long-standing housekeeper, who brought the disquiet to a head. A thin, nervous woman, she approached the vicar, her face pale, her hands twisting her apron. "Oh, Vicar? I'm so worried. I went to the manor this morning, just as I always do to prepare breakfast, and the door was unlocked. And Mrs. Pendleton wasn't there. Her bed hadn't been slept in." Her voice dropped to a frantic whisper. "She's not in the house, Vicar. I've looked everywhere. And her furs, her good furs are still in the closet." A hush fell over the small gathering. The festive spirit, just moments ago so vibrant, began to curdle into a chilling dread. Miss Marple, observing from a short distance, noticed the varied reactions, genuine concern on Mrs. Everett's face, a flicker of something almost like excitement in the eyes of Mrs. Davies, and a deep, unsettling fear etched upon Mrs. Finch's features. An unlocked door, an unslept bed, and a missing woman on Christmas Day. It was a most unseasonable mystery. Perhaps she simply went for an early walk, someone ventured, though the suggestion sounded hollow even to its speaker. In this bitter cold, without her furs? It seemed highly unlikely. The vicar, regaining some composure, declared he would immediately go to the manor with Mrs. Finch and, if necessary, send for Constable Higgins. Miss Marple exchanged a knowing glance with Mrs. Everett. The gentle calm of Christmas morning in Oakhaven had been irrevocably shattered. A disappearance on such a day felt not merely unsettling, but almost profane. Chapter 2: An empty house and a lingering scent. The news of Mrs. Pendleton's disappearance spread through Oakhaven with the speed of a winter gale, stripping away the remnants of festive cheer. Constable Higgins, a well-meaning but somewhat overwhelmed local officer, was at Oakhaven Manor by mid-morning, his presence a stark contrast to the house's usual quiet dignity. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Everett, found herself drawn to the scene, ostensibly to offer support to Mrs. Finch, who was by now inconsolable. Oakhaven Manor was a large, grey stone house, its windows like watchful eyes, now reflecting the muted winter light. Inside, it was a cavern of hushed elegance, meticulously maintained by Mrs. Pendleton's exacting standards. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of potpourri and old leather. Constable Higgins was making a rather perfunctory search, scratching his head and muttering about no signs of forced entry. She simply vanished into thin air, he declared to Miss Marple, who was quietly observing the drawing-room. Indeed, Constable, Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes taking in every detail. But people rarely vanish without a trace, do they? Mrs. Finch, pale and trembling, explained again to Higgins and later to Miss Marple how she had arrived at 7 a.m., as usual. The front door, it was just ajar, you see. Not wide open, but not properly shut. I thought perhaps Mrs. Pendleton had just stepped out for a moment, though it was awfully early for her. But then I found her bed untouched. Miss Marple walked slowly through the house. In the dining room, the table was set for one, a single, polished silver place setting awaiting a breakfast that would never be eaten. In the drawing-room, a book lay open on a small occasional table, its pages marked by a silver bookmark, The Romantics. The fire in the grate was cold, but the ash looked recently disturbed. Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple asked softly, did Mrs. Pendleton usually let her fire die out completely at night? Oh, no, Miss Marple. Never. She was most particular. Always banked it just so before retiring, to keep the chill away in the morning. She felt the cold dreadfully, did Mrs. Pendleton. This was the first subtle inconsistency. A woman who cherished warmth, leaving her fire to die on a bitter Christmas Eve. Miss Marple's gaze moved to a delicate porcelain teacup on the mantelpiece, its saucer holding a single, small shortbread biscuit. Was this here yesterday evening? Yes, Mrs. Finch confirmed, wiping a tear. After her evening tea. She always had a cup of Earl Grey before bed, and just one biscuit. She was very precise. Miss Marple merely nodded, but a tiny cog in her mind began to turn. The teacup and biscuit were perfectly placed. Too perfect, perhaps. And then there was the aroma. A faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air, not of Mrs. Pendleton's usual lavender sachet, but something sharper, more metallic, perhaps a hint of pipe tobacco? But Mrs. Pendleton detested smoking, and no one in the house smoked. Constable Higgins eventually moved to Mrs. Pendleton's dressing room, where a jewelry box lay open. Nothing seems to be missing here, he declared triumphantly. Her pearl necklace, the diamond earrings, all present and accounted for. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a small, empty velvet indent in the box. And this, Constable, she inquired gently, pointing to the indentation. What was kept here? Mrs. Finch peered over. Oh, that's where she kept her mother's cameo brooch, Miss Marple. The one with the tiny carved roses. It was very precious to her. She wore it often. A small, almost insignificant detail. A valuable brooch, not as grand as the pearls or diamonds, but deeply sentimental, was missing. Yet the more overtly valuable items remained. This did not suggest a simple robbery. If a thief had entered, why take only an antique brooch and leave the rest? And why, then, no sign of forced entry, no struggle? The missing brooch, combined with the unbanked fire and the lingering, alien scent, created a quiet discord in the otherwise orderly house. Mrs. Pendleton had not simply vanished, something had been deliberately, subtly, altered. The empty velvet hollow seemed to hum with unspoken questions, leaving Miss Marple with a distinct feeling of something carefully curated, a scene designed to mislead. Chapter 3: The Heirs and Their Grief. The following day brought not Mrs. Pendleton, but her solicitor, Mr. Humphrey, and her closest relatives to Oakhaven Manor. The police, now led by the slightly more astute Inspector Craddock, had commenced a more thorough, if still bewildered, investigation. Miss Marple, under the guise of offering Mrs. Everett moral support and helping Mrs. Finch, found herself perfectly positioned to observe the arriving dramatis personae. First to arrive was Mr. Arthur Pendleton, Mrs. Pendleton's nephew and the presumptive heir. A man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed even for such somber circumstances, he exuded an air of restrained composure. His grief seemed genuine, though perhaps a little too articulate, a touch too well practiced. He spoke of his aunt with respect and affection, lamenting her unfortunate tendency toward solitude. He arrived with his wife, Lydia, a woman whose beauty was only slightly marred by a certain watchful anxiety in her eyes. "This is simply ghastly," Arthur declared to Inspector Craddock, his voice modulated perfectly. "Aunt Eleanor would never simply disappear. She was a creature of habit, of routine. Unless something truly terrible has befallen her." He carefully avoided eye contact with Mrs. Finch, who hovered nervously nearby. Shortly after, Miss Eleanor Harding arrived. She was Mrs. Pendleton's niece, named after her aunt, and a much younger woman, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her arrival was far more dramatic. She burst into tears upon seeing the house, clutching a crumpled handkerchief, her lamentations loud and heartfelt. Her grief seemed unfeigned, almost raw. Eleanor was an artist, her clothes a little bohemian, her manner less polished than Arthur's. She had lived a modest life, supported by a small allowance from her aunt, and clearly adored Mrs. Pendleton. "Oh, Aunt Eleanor! Where could she be?" Eleanor cried, her voice echoing in the cold hall. "She was the only family I truly had. She was strict, yes, but she always cared for me." Inspector Craddock patiently interviewed both Arthur and Eleanor, establishing their whereabouts on Christmas Eve. Arthur had been at his London club until late, catching a train back to Oakhaven that evening, arriving home around midnight. Lydia corroborated his story, though she seemed somewhat distracted. Eleanor had spent the evening quietly at her small cottage in a nearby village, painting. She had no witnesses but claimed she never went out at night. As the solicitor, Mr. Humphrey, reviewed Mrs. Pendleton's papers, a casual remark from Arthur caught Miss Marple's attention. Aunt Eleanor was quite wealthy, of course. Her investments were always shrewd. But she was rather particular about her assets, kept a very close eye on everything. Eleanor, still tearful, looked up. "Yes, she was. She once told me she'd recently made some changes to her will, just to tidy things up," she said. "But she never told me what." This was an intriguing development. A recent alteration to a will, followed by a disappearance. Did the changes favor one relative over another, or perhaps someone entirely unexpected? Miss Marple observed Arthur Pendleton's almost imperceptible stiffening at Eleanor's mention of the will changes, and Lydia's quick, almost imperious glance at her husband. Arthur quickly smoothed his expression, but the brief flicker of tension did not escape Miss Marple. Later, as Mrs. Finch showed Inspector Craddock through Mrs. Pendleton's study, Miss Marple noticed a small detail. A desk drawer, usually kept meticulously locked, was slightly ajar. "Mrs. Finch," she inquired, "was this drawer usually open?" "Oh no, Miss Marple. Never." That was where Mrs. Pendleton kept her private papers. She was most particular about it, always locked it, always kept the key on her person. Her father's old silver pen was in there too, I believe. Craddock investigated, but the drawer appeared empty, save for a few old receipts. No silver pen. No private papers. The missing brooch, the unbanked fire, the strange scent, the open drawer, and now the mention of a recently altered will. The pieces were beginning to accumulate, each a tiny, unsettling fragment of a larger, still obscured picture. The heirs, with their carefully performed grief and subtle undercurrents of interest, now seemed inextricably woven into the fabric of the mystery. Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. Such a meticulous woman, to leave a drawer open, and a treasured pen missing. It was almost as if someone had wanted it to be found that way. Chapter 4, Whispers in the Parish. Oak Haven, usually so placid, now buzzed with the low thrum of speculation and rumor. The Christmas festivities had been largely abandoned, replaced by hushed conversations over garden fences and in the aisles of the village shop. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner and keen listening skills, found herself privy to a tapestry of village gossip, each thread potentially holding a key to Mrs. Pendleton's character and hidden life. "They say she was terribly strict," Mrs. Davies whispered to Mrs. Everett over a loaf of bread. "Never let her nephew, Arthur, borrow a penny more than she deemed fit, even though he's her only blood relation to speak of. And as for that young Eleanor, the artist, well, Mrs. Pendleton thought her quite frivolous. Arthur always seemed to be struggling, despite his polished appearance," Mrs. Everett mused, recalling past snippets of conversation. "He was in some sort of business venture, I believe, that wasn't doing terribly well." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking rhythmically on her knitting. "Sometimes," she observed, "those who seem most outwardly composed are struggling with the heaviest burdens." The vicar, Mr. Henderson, confided in Mrs. Everett that Mrs. Pendleton had seemed particularly agitated in the weeks leading up to Christmas. "She spoke to me after evensong, just last week," he recalled, a troubled expression on his face. "She mentioned a difficulty, a troublesome matter that was weighing heavily on her mind. She wouldn't elaborate, merely said it was a family affair that she wished to resolve before the year's end." A family affair. This resonated with the mention of the altered will. Miss Marple considered the two heirs, Arthur, outwardly calm but with a hint of financial strain, and Eleanor, openly emotional but perhaps with a quiet determination underneath. Both stood to gain, but their relationship with Mrs. Pendleton, and indeed with each other, seemed more complex than simple familial affection. A particularly colourful rumour came from old Mr. Pettigrew, the postman, who had a memory like an elephant for village comings and goings. Saw a young fella, a stranger, lurking about near the manor just a few nights before Christmas Eve, he grumbled to Miss Marple as she collected her mail. "Well dressed, but not from round here. Didn't look like no solicitor or relative I ever seen. Standing near the hedges, as if waiting for someone." A stranger? This was a new element. Could Mrs. Pendleton have had a secret rendezvous? Or perhaps a visitor she didn't want the village to know about? The idea of a clandestine meeting on a cold December night seemed very out of character for the staid Mrs. Pendleton. Unless, of course, the troublesome matter the vicar spoke of involved this stranger. Miss Marple, her mind sifting through the layers of gossip, found herself focusing on the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. While distraught, Mrs. Finch had been exceptionally precise in her recounting of events. Too precise, perhaps, on certain points, and strangely vague on others. Miss Marple recalled the faint, alien scent of pipe tobacco in the drawing room. Mrs. Finch had been adamant that no one smoked in the house. But what if a visitor had? A visitor Mrs. Finch had not mentioned, perhaps to protect Mrs. Pendleton's reputation, or her own. The image of the empty velvet indent in the jewelry box, the missing sentimental brooch, kept returning to Miss Marple. It wasn't about the monetary value. It was the choice of what was missing. Why something of sentimental value, not purely financial? And why the missing silver pen from the private papers drawer? These small, personal items spoke of an intimacy, a motive rooted not in common thievery, but in something far more personal and deep-seated. The whispers in the parish, though often muddled by conjecture, painted a picture of a woman with secrets, and of relatives with hidden pressures. The troublesome matter felt increasingly significant, a thread that promised to unravel the entire fabric of Mrs. Pendleton's disappearance. Chapter 5: A discrepancy in the story. Inspector Craddock, though thorough, was becoming increasingly frustrated. The house offered no clear answers, the village no solid leads beyond rumor, and the relatives no substantial alibis. He decided to re-interview Mrs. Finch, hoping a second recounting might jog a forgotten detail. Miss Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, accompanied Mrs. Everett to the manor to assist Mrs. Finch with the endless cups of tea and the general upheaval. "Now, Mrs. Finch," Craddock began, patiently, "you mentioned the front door was ajar when you arrived on Christmas morning. Was it locked or unlocked the evening before, when you left?" Mrs. Finch wrung her hands. "Oh, it was locked, Inspector. I always make sure. Mrs. Pendleton was very particular about security, especially living out here. I saw her lock it herself, just after I left, around 7:30. And you left promptly at 7:30? Yes, sir. As always. Dinner was cleared, the kitchen was tidied, and Mrs. Pendleton would settle down with her book and her Earl Grey. I heard the clock chime. Miss Marple, listening from the drawing-room doorway, felt a faint prickle of recognition. Something in Mrs. Finch's emphatic certainty, almost too perfect, felt off. She recalled Mrs. Pendleton's detailed daily routine, as described by Mrs. Everett. Dinner at 7, tea and reading by 8, bed by 9. If Mrs. Finch left at 7:30, Mrs. Pendleton would still be at dinner, or just finishing. Locking the door after she left implied Mrs. Finch was still present or watching. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple interjected softly, "you mentioned Mrs. Pendleton would have her tea and biscuit after you left. Did you always see her lock the door as you left, or did you simply assume she would, as was her habit?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, her gaze darting between the inspector and Miss Marple. A faint blush rose in her cheeks. "Well, I saw her go to the door. She always did. And she had her keys in her hand. But you didn't actually see her turn the lock." Miss Marple pressed, ever so gently. "You left before that moment, perhaps." A tremor ran through Mrs. Finch. I suppose I didn't actually watch the bolt turn, no. I just assumed. I was in a hurry, you see. My sister was expecting me for Christmas Eve. A small, but significant, discrepancy. Mrs. Finch, usually meticulous, had made an assumption about a critical detail. This opened a small window of opportunity. If Mrs. Pendleton hadn't locked the door, or if someone else had opened it shortly after Mrs. Finch left, the no forced entry argument became less relevant. Craddock, seeing the shift, continued. "And did anyone else call at the manor that evening, after you left?" Mrs. Finch shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. Mrs. Pendleton never had callers on Christmas Eve. It was her quiet time." "What about the young fella Mr. Pettigrew saw lurking about a few nights prior?" Miss Marple inquired. "Did you see anyone unusual near the house, Mrs. Finch?" Another hesitation. "Oh, a shadow or two, perhaps. But in the winter dusk, everything looks a bit indistinct." Her eyes, however, showed a flicker of something she was holding back. As the interview concluded, Miss Marple noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail. On the pristine, polished hall table, usually empty save for a silver salver, lay a tiny, dark speck. She moved closer. It was a fragment of a dried leaf, a tiny, almost black piece of ivy. It was an odd place for such a speck, given Mrs. Finch's obsessive cleaning. It was also consistent with someone having brushed against a creeper on the outside of the house, perhaps in the darkness, and carried it inside. Ivy grew thick on the north wall of the manor. The unlocked door and the unusual visitor were now beginning to connect. Mrs. Finch's careful account, so reliable on other matters, had faltered on the very point of security, and her reluctance to admit to seeing that stranger was telling. Someone had indeed entered or exited the manor, perhaps not by force, but by invitation, or by a door left deliberately ajar. The subtle details of the ivy speck and the precise timing of Mrs. Finch's departure painted a picture of a more complex entry than initially believed, suggesting a deliberate act rather than a simple, opportunistic crime. The silence of the house seemed to deepen, holding its breath. Chapter 6: The Gardener's Tale. The frosty grip of winter tightened its hold on Oak Haven, mirroring the chilled atmosphere in the village. With no new leads, Inspector Craddock focused his attention on the staff who knew Mrs. Pendleton's habits best. This brought him to Mr. Dobson, the elderly gardener, a man whose hands were gnarled like ancient roots but whose eyes missed very little. Mr. Dobson, a man of few words, met the inspector in his potting shed, the air thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and compost. Miss Marple, accompanying Mrs. Everett on a visit to collect some winter cuttings, happened to be nearby. "Now, Mr. Dobson," Craddock began, "you're at the manor most days, aren't you? What did you see or hear on Christmas Eve, or the days leading up to it?" Dobson wiped his hands on a sacking apron. I was there. Finished up the pruning of the roses on the 23rd, saw Mrs. Pendleton that afternoon, she was checking on the greenhouse. Always keen on her orchids, she was. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Any visitors, perhaps?" Dobson paused, gazing out at the skeletal branches of the fruit trees. "There was a fellow. Young chapter saw him too, maybe 3 times, that week before Christmas. Hanging about near the east gate, sometimes just walking down the lane, looking at the manor. Not from round here, I'd wager." Craddock's pen scratched on his notepad. "Can you describe him?" "Tallish, dark hair, neatly dressed, but not like a gentleman farmer, more town-bred, if you catch my meaning. Had a peculiar way of carrying himself, like he was always on the verge of rushing off." This matched Mr. Pettigrew's earlier, vague description of a stranger. "Did he approach the house? Speak to anyone?" "No, not that I saw. Just observing. Once, I saw him talking to Mrs. Finch, though. Down by the lane, near the rectory fields. A quick word, then he was off." This piece of information hit Miss Marple with the force of a small, but significant, revelation. Mrs. Finch had been adamant no one called at the manor on Christmas Eve, and had been vague about seeing the stranger. But she had spoken to him. Why conceal this? And why near the rectory fields, away from the manor, if it was an innocent encounter? Craddock pressed Dobson further. Did this young man ever enter the grounds, or seem to interact with Mrs. Pendleton? Dobson shook his head. Didn't see him on the grounds, no. And Mrs. Pendleton, she never took kindly to strangers. Especially not those who loitered. She'd have sent him packing with a sharp word. As Dobson continued to detail his movements, Miss Marple noticed his right hand. The little finger bore a faint, but distinct, white scar. A small, almost insignificant detail, yet it jogged her memory of a story she'd heard about Dobson in the village, a childhood accident with a rusty nail. But the scar looked too clean, too linear. Could it be a fresh injury, perhaps? No, that was pure speculation. but it lingered in her mind as an anomaly. Dobson then mentioned another detail. On Christmas Eve, I left the manor around 5, after tidying the tools. The air was getting sharp. Saw Mrs. Pendleton through the drawing-room window then. She was sitting by the fire, reading. Looked quite peaceful. Didn't see anyone else about. This confirmed Mrs. Finch's timeline. Mrs. Pendleton was in the house and seemingly well at 5. But it cast the subsequent events into deeper shadow. What had transpired between 5 and Mrs. Finch's departure at 7:30, and then Mrs. Pendleton's disappearance? Miss Marple quietly observed Dobson, noting his careful, almost rehearsed manner. He seemed to be telling the truth, but his quick, almost nervous glance towards the manor's east gate when he mentioned the stranger was not lost on her. The revelation about Mrs. Finch's conversation with the young man was highly significant. It suggested a secret channel of communication, a hidden agenda, or perhaps a prearranged plan involving the housekeeper. The quiet village was proving to be a tangle of untold stories, and the gardener's seemingly innocuous tale had just added a crucial, unsettling thread to the weaving mystery. The stranger, the gardener's observation, and Mrs. Finch's suppressed knowledge were beginning to form a pattern of concealed interactions that contradicted the picture of Mrs. Pendleton's solitary Christmas Eve. Chapter 7: A Hidden Letter and a Secret Past. The investigation felt as though it was stagnating. Inspector Craddock was considering bringing in a larger police contingent, much to the villagers' dismay. Mrs. Everett, ever practical, decided it was time for a thorough tidying of Mrs. Pendleton's study, a room the police had already searched but, perhaps, overlooked certain domestic details. Miss Marple, of course, was delighted to assist. While dusting a rather cumbersome collection of Victorian travel books, Miss Marple's delicate fingers brushed against a loose panel behind a bookshelf. It was expertly crafted, almost imperceptible. With a gentle tug, it opened, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, nestled among a few yellowed photographs, was a single, folded letter. It was addressed to Mrs. Pendleton, in a distinctive, elegant hand. Miss Marple carefully opened it, her heart giving a little flutter of anticipation. The letter was dated just 3 weeks prior to Christmas Eve. My dearest Eleanor, I know this news will come as a shock, after all these years. Fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of timing. I am in Oak Haven for a short while, and though I hesitate to disturb your peace, there are matters of utmost urgency that simply cannot wait. Our daughter, Clara, is very ill, and her situation is desperate. I would not ask this of you unless it was truly a matter of life or death. I must see you, Eleanor. I will call at the manor on Christmas Eve, around 8 o'clock, as I know your housekeeper will have departed by then. Please, for Clara's sake, do not refuse me this meeting. I still wear the cameo, you know. It reminds me of the girl you once were. With hope, and a heavy heart Julian A gasp escaped Mrs. Everett's lips as she read over Miss Marple's shoulder. Clara? Our Mrs. Pendleton had a daughter? A Julian. Miss Marple's mind reeled. A secret daughter, a past love, a clandestine meeting on Christmas Eve, a critically ill child, and the mention of the cameo brooch the very item that was missing from Mrs. Pendleton's jewelry box. This was a revelation of immense magnitude, completely rewriting the narrative of Mrs. Pendleton's life and her disappearance. The troublesome matter the vicar spoke of now made perfect sense. Inspector Craddock was immediately summoned. He read the letter, his face a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. A secret child, and a meeting on Christmas Eve. This changes everything. The letter provided a new, compelling motive for Mrs. Pendleton's presence in the house on Christmas Eve, a reason for a visitor, and a possible explanation for the unlocked door and the missing brooch. Julian had the brooch, presumably given to him by Mrs. Pendleton during their secret meeting. But who was Julian? And what had happened to Mrs. Pendleton after this meeting? The photographs in the compartment also offered clues. One showed a younger Mrs. Pendleton, vibrant and beautiful, arm in arm with a handsome young man, unmistakably Julian. Another was a portrait of a solemn-faced young woman, with Mrs. Pendleton's eyes, Clara. This secret passed through the motives of the other characters into a new light. Arthur and Eleanor, the presumed heirs, would have been deeply affected by the appearance of a direct heir. Could they have known? Could they have acted to prevent this? The desperation of Julian's letter, referencing a dying daughter and pleading for help, painted a picture of a fraught and emotional encounter. Miss Marple's mind connected the dots: the missing brooch, the open drawer in the study, perhaps where Julian, in haste, rummaged for something, or where Mrs. Pendleton kept funds for Clara, the strange scent of pipe tobacco, Julian's, perhaps, and the carefully placed teacup and biscuit, staging a scene of calm that never truly existed. The village gossip about a stranger and Mrs. Finch's concealed conversation with him now pointed towards Julian, or perhaps an intermediary. The story was no longer about a simple disappearance, but a complex tapestry of hidden lives, desperate pleas, and the weight of long-held secrets. The discovery of the letter felt like the dam breaking, unleashing a flood of possibilities, each more disquieting than the last. Chapter 8: The Motif of the Missing Object. The discovery of Julian's letter dramatically reshaped the police's focus. Inspector Craddock immediately launched an urgent search for Julian and Clara, dispatching inquiries to nearby towns and even London. The initial assumption of a simple disappearance or robbery was replaced by a more complex, emotionally charged narrative involving a hidden past and a desperate plea. Miss Marple, however, returned to the manor, her thoughts centered on the missing cameo brooch. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol, mentioned explicitly in Julian's letter as a reminder of their shared past. Its disappearance, rather than its monetary value, was what held significance. She re-examined the jewelry box in Mrs. Pendleton's dressing room, staring at the empty velvet hollow. If Julian had taken it, or if Mrs. Pendleton had given it to him, why would he leave behind all the other, more valuable items? Or, conversely, if someone else had taken it, trying to make it look like a gift or an agreed exchange, why leave the diamonds and pearls? It is most peculiar, Miss Marple murmured to herself, as Mrs. Finch fussed around her, still reeling from the revelations. The valuable items untouched, but this one, deeply personal piece, is gone. She remembered Mrs. Finch's description of Mrs. Pendleton's habits. She wore it often. Perhaps it was not in the box to begin with? Mrs. Finch, she inquired, do you recall if Mrs. Pendleton was wearing the cameo brooch on Christmas Eve? Mrs. Finch thought hard. Let me see. She was wearing her dark green velvet dress for dinner. And yes, she was Miss Marple. I remember thinking how lovely it looked. A tiny touch of elegance, even though she was alone. This was a critical piece of information. If Mrs. Pendleton was wearing the brooch, then Julian had not taken it from the jewelry box, it had been on her person. This meant either Mrs. Pendleton had given it to him during their meeting, or it had been removed from her after she disappeared. Miss Marple then recalled the other missing item, the silver pen from the locked study drawer, the drawer that was found slightly ajar. And the silver pen, Mrs. Finch. Was that also something Mrs. Pendleton kept for sentimental reasons? Oh, yes indeed. It was her father's, from his days at Oxford. She never used it, but she always kept it locked away, a little memento. Two missing items, both of sentimental value, not significant monetary worth. This suggested a motive far removed from greed. It suggested a message, a personal connection, or a desperate act. If Julian took the brooch, perhaps as a token of their renewed connection or a desperate pledge for his daughter, why also the pen? And why leave the drawer ajar? Miss Marple's mind turned to the young man Mr. Pettigrew and Mr. Dobson had seen, that stranger, that town-bred fellow. And then, the conversation between Mrs. Finch and this stranger near the rectory fields. Why the secrecy? Was Mrs. Finch acting as an intermediary for Julian? Perhaps delivering his letter or arranging the meeting. She then remembered the faint scent of pipe tobacco. Julian? Or someone else? Could that stranger be someone other than Julian, someone who had intercepted or shadowed Julian, and then entered the house? The pieces were beginning to fit, but in an unsettling way. The disappearance was too carefully orchestrated, yet imperfect in its details. The missing brooch and pen weren't signs of a panicked thief, but of a deliberate selection. It almost felt as if they were intended as clues, or, more darkly, as a means of erasing a particular history. Mrs. Pendleton had a secret daughter, a desperate former lover, and a meeting arranged for Christmas Eve. Someone had definitely been in the house after Mrs. Finch left. Miss Marple's gentle features hardened slightly. She had seen such carefully constructed deceptions before, born not of grand schemes, but of the convoluted workings of human hearts. The motif of the missing object wasn't about what was taken, but what it represented, hinting at a truth far more painful than anyone in Oakhaven dared imagine. Chapter 9: The Unraveling Thread. The news of Mrs. Pendleton's secret daughter, Clara, and the mysterious Julian, had sent shockwaves through Oakhaven. The village now had a concrete, if tragic, explanation for Mrs. Pendleton's troublesome matter. Inspector Craddock was convinced that Julian was either the culprit or held the key to her whereabouts. Yet, Miss Marple remained quietly unconvinced by the most obvious conclusion. She sat by the fire in Rose Cottage, her knitting needle still, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Mrs. Everett looked worriedly at her friend. "You seem troubled, Jane. Do you think Julian is truly responsible?" "I don't know, Caroline," Miss Marple replied softly. "But certain details still vex me. The unlocked door, for example. If Julian was expected at 8, why would Mrs. Pendleton leave the door ajar much earlier, when Mrs. Finch left at 7:30? It suggests an earlier, perhaps unscheduled, visitor." She went over the evidence again. The unbanked fire, the perfectly placed teacup and biscuit, the faint scent of pipe tobacco, the ivy speck, the missing cameo brooch from Mrs. Pendleton's person, the missing silver pen from the locked drawer, and Mrs. Finch's discomfiture regarding that stranger. And the stranger Mr. Dobson saw, Miss Marple mused aloud. Tallish, dark hair, town-bred. Mr. Pettigrew saw him too. And Mrs. Finch spoke to him. Why hide that? A sudden thought, like a flash of lightning, illuminated Miss Marple's mind. She stood up abruptly. "The scar, Caroline! The scar on Mr. Dobson's finger." Mrs. Everett looked bewildered. "The gardener? What about it?" Mr. Dobson mentioned a childhood accident, a rusty nail. But the scar looked too clean, too linear. And then he mentioned seeing Mrs. Pendleton at 5, through the drawing-room window. Peaceful, reading. And that he left the manor at 5. Miss Marple paced the small parlour. Consider Arthur Pendleton. He arrived home at midnight on Christmas Eve, according to him and his wife, Lydia. But Mr. Dobson saw a stranger speaking with Mrs. Finch. What if that stranger wasn't Julian at all, but someone else, an intermediary, or perhaps even Arthur himself, making a discreet visit before his official return? She recalled Arthur's slightly too composed grief, Lydia's anxious glances. His business ventures were struggling. Eleanor had mentioned a recently altered will. The appearance of a direct heir, Clara, would disinherit Arthur entirely. The motive was clear. And Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple continued, piecing it together. Her precise account, but her hesitation about the door, and her reluctance to admit speaking to that stranger. What if she was covering for someone? The ivy speck on the hall table. The ivy on the north wall of the manor. If someone had entered discreetly from that side, perhaps through a back door or window, they might have brushed against it. But the front door was ajar. No, Miss Marple corrected herself, the front door being ajar was part of the staging. To make it look like she simply walked out. But the unbanked fire, the teacup, the biscuit, they suggested she was still there, or had just left. It's a conflict. Then it all clicked into place. The pipe tobacco, the scar, the timing. Mr. Dobson, Miss Marple said, almost to herself. He smokes a pipe, occasionally, doesn't he, Caroline? And that scar, what if it was not from a childhood accident, but a more recent injury? She recalled the way he glanced towards the east gate, as if expecting someone, or remembering someone. Mrs. Finch, seeing a younger, potentially charming, town-bred man, might have been swayed to give him information, or even access. What if that stranger was Arthur, in disguise, or using an intermediary to sound out the situation? The revelation of the letter from Julian, demanding a meeting, offered a perfect opportunity for someone else to act. If Mrs. Pendleton were to disappear after meeting Julian, suspicion would naturally fall on him, the desperate lover. Miss Marple's eye sharpened. The missing brooch on Mrs. Pendleton's person, the silver pen from the study. Not items of great value, but of great sentiment. If someone wanted to frame Julian, or simply erase the evidence of his visit, what better way than to take tokens that connect Mrs. Pendleton to him, and to their shared past? The brooch he mentioned in his letter, and the pen from her private papers, perhaps to imply she'd written him a final, desperate note. The scene was set. Mrs. Pendleton, dressed in velvet, wearing her cameo, was expecting Julian. But someone else, aware of the meeting, perhaps even through Mrs. Finch, had arrived earlier. They found Mrs. Pendleton, maybe confronted her about the will, or about Clara, and a struggle ensued. The meticulous staging of the scene, the unlocked front door, the untouched valuables, all designed to create confusion, to make it appear she had either left willingly, or that Julian was responsible. The thread had been found, and Miss Marple knew precisely where it led. Chapter 10, A Gentle Unmasking. The small parlour of Oakhaven Manor felt unusually crowded. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his expression grim. Arthur and Lydia Pendleton sat stiffly on the sofa, while Eleanor Harding nervously twisted her handkerchief. Mrs. Finch hovered near the door, pale and tearful. Even Mr. Dobson, the gardener, had been asked to attend, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Miss Marple, seated in her customary quiet corner, held everyone's gaze with her serene, almost apologetic, blue eyes. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but clear, "I believe the solution to Mrs. Pendleton's disappearance lies not in a sudden, violent act of a stranger, but in the careful, almost theatrical, efforts of someone closer to home to conceal a tragic truth." Craddock nodded, indicating for her to continue. "We have Julian's letter," she stated, requesting a meeting with Mrs. Pendleton on Christmas Eve, at 8 o'clock, after Mrs. Finch had left. And we know Mrs. Pendleton was in the house at 5, seen by Mr. Dobson. The critical period, therefore, is between 5 and 8 o'clock. She paused, allowing this to sink in. The unlocked front door was puzzling. Mrs. Finch was certain Mrs. Pendleton would have locked it. But the fire was unbanked, the teacup and biscuit were laid out. This suggested a departure, but one not prepared for. Miss Marple then looked at Mrs. Finch. "Mrs. Finch, you admitted to not actually seeing Mrs. Pendleton turn the key. And you also neglected to mention you had spoken to a stranger near the rectory fields, a few days prior to Christmas Eve. This stranger was Mr. Arthur Pendleton." Arthur stiffened, his composure finally cracking. Lydia gasped. Mrs. Finch, having overheard Mrs. Pendleton's distress about the troublesome matter, namely, Julian and Clara, and knowing of Arthur's financial difficulties and his hope for an inheritance, felt a misguided loyalty. She contacted Arthur, perhaps believing she was helping protect the family reputation or his future. Arthur, upon learning of Julian's impending visit and Mrs. Pendleton's intention to acknowledge Clara, saw his inheritance vanish. He arrived at the manor shortly after Mrs. Finch left at 7:30, entering through a door Mrs. Finch had deliberately left ajar for him after her own departure. She had seen the letter, too, and believed the meeting would be for the best of all parties if he was present to mediate the dot. Mrs. Finch burst into fresh sobs. He said he only wanted to talk to her. To reason with her. Miss Marple continued, her gaze now on Arthur. You found Mrs. Pendleton, dressed in her green velvet, wearing the cameo brooch Julian mentioned. A heated argument ensued, perhaps about the will, perhaps about Clara's rightful inheritance. In a moment of panic, or rage, you caused her death, Mr. Pendleton. Arthur was pale, his hands clenched into fists. Then, Miss Marple explained, you had to make her disappearance look like a deliberate act, perhaps by Julian, or a voluntary flight. You left the front door ajar to suggest she walked out. You removed the cameo brooch from her person, both to erase a link to Julian and as a trophy of your desperate act. And you opened the study drawer, taking her father's silver pen, again, something personal, to imply she might have written a note, or left in a hurry, taking a memento. The pipe tobacco scent, you see, was yours, Arthur, a brand you favored but only smoked when you believed no one was watching, a habit your aunt deplored. Lydia, her face ashen, buried her face in her hand.